Hello and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. My name is James, your host. I started this podcast to help other folks share their own healing stories and to interview thought leaders and experts in the carnivore, keto, and low oxalate space. Before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to Equip Foods and the Carnivore Bar. As an affiliate, you can use the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products when you check out using the code Carnivorist. Thanks in advance for listening, subscribing, and any likes or shares. And now, on with the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Carnivorist Chats. It's James, your host. Today is one of my favorite days on Carnivorist Chats because I have one of my favorite people in the world returning to chat with me, Monique Attinger, the Low Ox Coach. Welcome back to Carnivorist Chats.
Thanks, James. Lovely to be here as usual. Yeah, we have too much fun when we do this. So we should have to pay somebody to do it.
I totally agree. This much fun should be illegal. I hate to use the word, but I geek out on these episodes because I learn so much. And I want to say thank you again for taking the time out to do these with me. And it's been so beneficial for the listeners because I'm getting so much great feedback when I post them together, especially. And for folks that need to go back and watch from our very first episode, which was episode 35 in season 2. And then we did an episode, which was a Q&A day 2. And then episode 44 this season 3, which was another Q&A. And today's one, which again, the users submitted their questions via Instagram to us for Monique to answer. And we're going to dive right in, Monique, because we've got a lot to get through, some really interesting topics, if it's okay with you.
Absolutely. We do have some great topics. So this should be fun.
The very first question, actually, as we were just talking about offline, ties into how we left off our last episode, which was talking about how oxalates impact people's digestion. The very first question asks, the daily amount of oxalate a person with disturbed digestion should have. And I know there's some nuance to this, so I'll let you have at it.
So where I want to start with this is that when I went to a low oxalate diet, digestion was actually one of the things that improved first. So I was one of those people who on my probably more plant-based, like not fully vegan, but tending towards vegetarian and more plant-based diet, I was taking handfuls, like almost literally handfuls of digestive enzymes and things like ox bile just to try and get my food done. And it was miserable. It just felt like my whole digestive system was just so sluggish and compromised. And I hear this a lot from people who are thinking that they have oxalate issues. My gut's leaky. It feels like I can't do what I need to do with my food. And in fact, it is not that surprising for a couple of reasons. Now, one is that oxalate can be taken up into the liver and can be impacting our production of bile. This is not good if you're trying to digest any kind of fat or oil because you need that bile. And in fact, when the bile is being secreted, because oxalate gets secreted out of the tissues, this secretion process can mean that you actually have oxalate going into the food while you're trying to get the bile into the food. And then oxalate can actually be impacting our ability to produce pancreatic enzymes. And that's because the pancreas is a big consumer of bicarbonate. In the same way that sulfate transporters can move oxalate, turns out bicarbonate transporters, cell transporters can move oxalate. And so your pancreas might be struggling a little bit. And the combination of those two is a 1-2 hit on digestion. It's a 1-2 punch, right? And so what I want people to consider is that perhaps if they have disturbed digestion, that it is related to oxalate. And if then they're thinking about how much oxalate they can take in a day and still support their healing, that one of the things they have to consider is how unwell they are now. And the more unwell, ironically, the more likely they should go slowly with reducing oxalate so that we're not getting this big wave of oxalate hitting the tissues. Perhaps the liver and the pancreas struggle more. We need more research on some of this, but that would be my working hypothesis because I often see when people are mobilizing oxalate, they get a repeat of this poor digestion. So, yeah, so it is a very nuanced little question. If you're taking in a very high oxalate diet, come down slowly. And you may want to keep digestive enzymes and things like ox bile or taurine on hand to support the liver, to support the pancreas, and use them maybe intermittently. If I'm feeling okay and my digestion's doing okay, then maybe I don't need them. But maybe if stuff's happening, oxalate's mobilized, for some reason I've had a high oxalate meal, I might need some of those. And, getting to a low oxalate diet's not necessarily something where you get a ribbon if you get there faster. The big thing is like getting to the healing, right? So if our bodies have been using oxalate, our microbes in the gut have been using oxalate as a kind of fuel. What we want to do is shift how much oxalate we're taking in slowly so the microbiome can respond to that. And we're not just all of a sudden making a big swing and then our body's homeostasis is thrown off. And so that, I mean, really, that's one of the things when we're talking about disturbed digestion. I think we also have to keep in mind some people talk about gut healing and they don't realize that oxalate's actually part of their gut healing. One of the best things I did in terms of my gut and the whole leaky gut and all that was lower my oxalate. But again, slow, steady, and try to respect your body's level of resilience. If you're not feeling very resilient, come down slow. If you feel relatively healthy, then maybe you can come down a little bit faster. And I do think if you're relatively healthy, you can come in the range of a medium oxalate intake. That was defined by the Vulvar Pain Foundation as between 61 and 100 milligrams of oxalate a day. That's actually pretty easy to do. And it even allows for some room for, say, slightly higher oxalate foods. Most of the people I work with will do reasonably well and maybe fine at 60 to 80 milligrams, even over the long haul. It'll really depend on how well their body can cope with the stresses that oxalate presents. In my own case, over time, I noticed I felt better the lower my oxalate was. And so I, like you now, well, I may not be as good a carnivore as you are. I probably cheat a little bit, but basically the lower my oxalate intake is, the better I feel. So I stick at a very low level, but I would follow, if you will, your body's lead on that kind of thing.
This next question kind of ties into it in a way that was particularly interesting to me because this person asked, does non-fermented dairy contain oxalates? They're still reacting to butter and milk. Now, I say this with the caveat that for me, when I first started out, I wanted to incorporate dairy back in, but I struggled mightily, even with fermented dairy, which I think was probably a histamine response to the fermentation. Through trial and error and slowly, low and slow, I've managed to add dairy back in and I have no consequence. I think that is also part and parcel because I healed my gut, stopped bombing it with the high oxalate foods.
Yep.
And it is, as we know and have talked about in past episodes, very important in terms of the calcium to bind the oxalate as your body starts to excrete and through the dumping process. But having discussed this with you just offline, there are a couple of really interesting things that is going to come out of this discussion. So please let the listeners know about this one.
So I will start out by saying, when it comes to oxalate and getting it out of your system, mineral levels are job one. Because as a mineral chelator and I would say an indiscriminate mineral chelator, oxalate is going to impact them in a significant way. And so that is one of the reasons that if people can keep dairy in their diet, I recommend it because it's a high mineral food, whole food, and generally is low in oxalate. But there's a gotcha here potentially. If you have non-fermented dairy, in most cases, whether we're talking about even things like cheeses or, raw milk or whatever version of dairy, butter, it's going to be low oxalate. Unless the animals are foraging on high oxalate forage. Okay. So the thing about oxalate is that the research in the veterinarian world has discovered that if mum sheep, cow, goat is eating high oxalate forage, and that oxalate's being absorbed. So even with a multi-chambered stomach, blah, 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 they are not necessarily breaking down that oxalate sufficiently if they're eating really high oxalate forage. It's getting into their system. We do know from the veterinarian research world that oxalate can be taken up and get through the placenta. We also have some understanding of the fact that the higher oxalate the animal's taking in, the more likely it turns up in their milk. So what do we do then? Like, we've got this great farmer lives down the road from us. We're getting, pristine, organic, wild forage animals. But what if they're eating high oxalate? And without testing, it's really hard to know for sure. But one of the things from the research is that they discovered that animals of, sheep, goats, cattle, if they're on high forage, will miscarry more readily. So if for some reason your farmer says, well, everything's going really well, but my animals don't carry their pregnancies well, if somebody's happened to say that, that would be an alert that they've got something in those fields that's high oxalate, and maybe those animals are getting too much of it. Is dairy generally low oxalate? Yes, it is. But can there be caveats? Yeah, there can be. So yeah.
I just love this stuff. I really do. I mean, as I talk about often with you, every day is a learning day. And when you talked about this, I was like, wow, that really makes sense. And I think this will spur a lot of people to ask, especially if, and we should be trying to get organic and pasture raised dairy and beef. It will prompt a lot of people to ask their farmers, which is always a good thing. What are your cattle and or sheep grazing on?
Yeah,
On to
because I did mention a few herbs that are problematic, like purslane and chickweed, and there's different things like that which can be naturally occurring in a field. There's others. If people were curious about, high oxalate herbals or weeds, I could get a bigger list of it. But yeah, if they are grazing on that kind of stuff, some of that oxalate will be potentially getting into their system and their milk. Yeah.
as I say, it's just incredible as you start to go down rabbit holes and do the research. And it just is so intriguing. This next
Yeah.
one is another intriguing one, Monique, because the listener asked, will histamine affecting hormones, specifically estrogen, ever balance out when you're on and off dumping?
This is one of those, I call it areas where things are entangled. And it's not, I don't even think on the radar of most researchers. And like even trying to dig into the research myself, it's sometimes there might be an indicator from a piece of research which has a completely different, focus. And so I'm having a hard time trying to get sort of clarity on this, but here's what I know and some of the hypotheses I'm working with, which include the fact that histamine, hormones, and oxalate are another one of these areas that I would refer to as a three-ring circus. So there's things going back and forth between these things, and it's like I feel like it's a relationship status. It's complicated. So what I know, like kind of at a high level from research that I've read, is that hormones affect oxalate trafficking. That's a very interesting little statement there. What I also know is that histamine as a signaling molecule can have some interaction with hormones. And just by way of an interesting little tidbit, histamine's involved with orgasm. So for those of you who like little tidbits, so there's a very clear link there between, let's say, hormonally sensitive tissues and histamine. This is very intriguing as well. And oxalate is now starting to have a reputation as a mast cell irritant, as a potential trigger, if you will, to histamine downstream. So we've got this kind of messy situation. And what I can tell you is that many of my female clients who are still menstruating can report regular sort of short dumping cycles that correspond to the beginning of their menstrual period. And so that is that PMS time period, estrogen does this, drops. And so it does look like there's a protective, if you will, function to estrogen, which may slow down oxalate dumping, inhibit it in some way. Again, not something that I've seen clarified in the research. But I had that experience myself, like that at the start of every menstrual cycle, I'd have this little mini oxalate dump that I could anticipate, I could get out in front of, I could take supplements to help myself with. But now over time, I'm also seeing women as they go into menopause, estrogen overall is going to drop. And some of these people are finding as menopause begins, all of a sudden, that's what's making them aware of their oxalate issue. It's like that's the trigger to kind of expose it. So we really have a complex situation here, but I am at the moment working with the hypothesis that if estrogen is dropping temporarily or dropping as part of the overall life cycle, that may reveal an oxalate problem. And for women, it may be, things like bladder irritation, vulvodynia, these kinds of things, or symptoms related to these kinds of conditions. And, we really do better as the oxalate load in the body is released. So I do see people as they bring down their oxalate and as they're mobilizing oxalate out, things do settle out. I don't know how quickly. It depends where the oxalate's stored. Yeah, again, we really do have this three-ring circus of things that are moving around and influencing each other. And so there's lots going on there.
Status complicated.
Yep, relationship status complicated. Yeah.
I love that. And speaking of things, segueing right into the next question, Monique, that you have had with experience with yourself, crystals coming out of the eyes. Is this a real thing that happens?
My beginning of my oxalate journey was like 15 years ago. So this is a while ago, but about somewhere around 12 years ago. So it wasn't right away. It was something that got going a little bit later in terms of moving oxalate out of the body. And I'll preamble that with saying oxalate does take a long time to leave because it's governed by secretion and it's not happening at a constant process. It's sort of doing these waves of oxalate that leave. And you can have it in places where tissues are either slow to secrete or slow to remodel, like the bones. So oxalate's kind of an interesting process in terms of mobilizing it out. Now, that said, we do know from the research on genetic hyperoxaluria that oxalate can be present in the eyes. Now, my argument would be once oxalate's in your bloodstream, it doesn't matter whether it came from your diet or it came from the genetic issue where your metabolism is making more of it. It's still in your bloodstream. It can still be trafficked. It can still do the things that oxalate can do. So about 12 years ago, I remember having one eye suddenly become extremely painful, like extremely painful. Like I just wanted to keep it covered all the time. And I finally went to urgent care because I was like, I'm not sure what's going on in there. I can't see anything in it. Let's just get it checked out. And I was a little suspicious what was going on, but I thought, go and get it checked out. Doctor checks, dilates the eye, takes the big lens, looks at it, and then says to me, you've got a cut on your cornea. And there had been nothing Like, let's be clear, I had put nothing in my eye. I had felt nothing drop into my eye. That wasn't the scenario. It was, I went to bed one night fine. I woke up in the morning with the eye hurting, right? And all I could think of was if I moved an oxalate crystal out in the night, and you know how your eyes flutter with REM and stuff? What if I was just moving that thing over the cornea? Anyway, long story short, it healed up. Everything was fine. But I did go through this period, probably about, yeah, 4 to 6 months or so, where there was grit kind of around my eyes every morning when I woke up. And there is research that talks about the impact of oxalate to the eyes in genetic hyperoxaluria. So I think this is something that can happen regardless of what the source of the oxalate is, your own metabolism or your diet. So that would be my call on this one.
Also, I'm just going to ask you one last question pertaining to this is that are styes, can they be oxalates coming out or styes in the eye? I've heard that that's a possibility too.
I think so because the eye is secreting things out, specifically tears, right? So if you're blocking a tear duct or if you're causing irritation along the edge of the eye where a sty would happen, I see no reason why like a small oxalate crystal couldn't be the irritation that starts something off, and then, some microbe or bacteria or whatever taking advantage of it. So yeah, yeah, I think that's a real thing.
Makes total sense to me, especially knowing how the body likes to excrete through, come out through salivary glands and sweat and stool and urine. It's going to find the path of least resistance, hopefully, and get out.
Well, and with oxalate, it is secreted. So it's not like a passive movement. The body has to do something to move it. And we can secrete, through the skin, sweat glands, tear ducts, respiratory system. We can be secreting in lots of ways. So it may also be that we're not paying attention to oxalate for, I'll say, a regular human being, right, who doesn't have a genetic issue, because we think the only way that oxalate's going to turn up is as a kidney stone. But that's, I think, ignoring what we know about oxalate from the standpoint of genetic hyperoxaluria. Because if it's being secreted for those people to try and deal with what's happening, why wouldn't it be secreted for those of us who are getting it from the diet? And honestly, a lot of the researchers do not realize that people like you and I, who have been very plant-based, could be taking in thousands of milligrams of oxalate a day. So a lot of the research assumes that, a high oxalate diet is like 500 milligrams. And that just makes me laugh. If you're taking in 500 milligrams, that's nothing, right? That's an easy deal. No, yeah.
This next one was interesting because I have to admit I had to look up what the PVC stood for. But this person asked, can excess histamine cause PVC problems? And PVC, folks, stands for premature ventricular contractions with the heart. For example, extra and reoccurring. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, histamine has all kinds of impacts in the body. And if you even just look at those who have anaphylaxis, where they have really severe allergies, that histamine gets released and all kinds of things happen, including impacts to the heart and cardiovascular system. So I was pretty suspicious that it could be related. With that said, I'm really just a nutritionist. And although people ask me tough questions and I come up with answers, let's just say that I'm not a doctor here. But at the same time, in my life before becoming a nutritionist, I have a master's in library and information science. So I am pretty good when it comes to diving into PubMed and finding things. And with this question, I did dive into PubMed, and I did find an excellent article. It's an older one from 1986, but it talks about the various kinds of impacts to the heart. And my initial reading of that would be that histamine could absolutely be related to things that affect either heart rate, heart, what would I say, management, the way that the blood flow, moves through the heart. And our heart valves are electrical. So it's, there's some very interesting things to say there in terms of how oxalate might be impacting that kind of function. But I do have a research link, and maybe we can put it in the notes and let people do a little bit of reading. I really liked that this particular article was looking at histamine and heart function overall. So while it's not specific to PVC, I think that it does sort of give you an idea about how histamine as a signaling molecule can be doing all kinds of things other than giving us allergies. And again, just from the standpoint of understanding that histamine is good for us, it's part of our normal healthy functioning. Histamine's involved with the sleep-wake cycle. Histamine's involved with the peristaltic wave and our digestion. There's all kinds of places where we're using histamine, I'm going to say productively. But when you get to, we've got too much histamine in the system, that's where you can kind of get some of these other things going on.
I'm actually, if it's okay with you, I'm going to jump this next one because I want to combine the question we received on parasites with the one that we also got on CIRS, because I have a little bit of a story and that has to do with inflammation in our immune system, both of those things. I want to touch on this next one because for me, people often ask me, when you were at your sickest, James, I had a litany of symptoms, and they often ask me, what was the worst one you had to deal with? And in an honest moment, yeah, my digestion was a wreck. My skin, my hair, my nails were cracking, and I was losing weight no matter how much I put in my mouth. But it was the brain fog that really scared me, because I was like, is this going to be my lot in life for the rest of my life? Am I getting early onset Alzheimer's here? I couldn't think straight. The brain fog was unrelenting. And this listener asked, oxalate-induced brain fog, why it happens and how it heals. Again, nuanced, but over to you, Monique.
I'll just start out by saying I suspect, and again, need to have more research on what the heck oxalate's doing, but I suspect that oxalate-induced brain fog may actually be histamine-induced brain fog. And that's because oxalate is irritating mast cells, and then they are releasing histamine. And so I think it's a set of dominoes as opposed to a one direct kind of impact. And the thing that makes me more inclined to think that way is now that I've been digging into the histamine world, because more and more of my clients are dealing kind of both with histamine symptoms and with oxalate symptoms. Brain fog is something they talk about in the histamine world too. And our histamine in our body is functional, but can be doing things that we don't want it to do. And for those who have got some experience with allergies and that kind of thing, there's this concept of the histamine bucket. And you can fill that bucket up in all kinds of ways. But once the bucket is full and it starts to spill over, you can get different kinds of symptoms. One of which I think can be brain fog. Now, why brain fog, right? Like that, why would histamine and oxalate somehow make brain fog? Our bodies use histamine for our sleep wake cycle in the brain. And when histamine goes up, that means that tells the brain we're supposed to be awake and alert. But then it's supposed to go up and stay up stably. And then when it's time to sleep, it drops to signal to the brain it's time to sleep, and then has to stay down. What if you're doing this, right? If you're going up and down all the time. Or what if your histamine hovers too high? And so then a little impact to your histamine is already knocking you up too high. And then when it falls back, your brain thinks it's supposed to be going to sleep, right? Like, I think sharpness of thought suffers with this kind of histamine bounce around happening in the brain. And we now know that there's actually mast cells in the brain, which we didn't know that before. That's new research. So in my own case, when I was early on the diet, because my daughter was still pretty young, I remember sitting at the table across from her. She would have been about 3.5, 4. And I said to her, give me that and I started to flutter like this, like that thing in front of me. And my daughter, 4-year-old, cocks her head, looks at me and says, Mama, the book? Like I thought for sure that my brain was somehow going to be compromised. I actually started to wonder about early dementia myself. Turned out my IQ and all the good stuff was still in there somewhere, but I needed to have this proper cycle back. I needed to have that kind of good, clear focus back. And you can talk to people who have allergies and how they start to feel a little like less clear when their allergies are up, right? I think this is another one of those things where we've got some stuff kind of swirling together and entangled with each other. And again, it's like oxalate and histamine dominoes and how those two affect each other. So anything that trips histamine might trip brain fog. If I overdo dairy, I'll do it to myself again. I don't usually do too much dairy anymore because I know what it does to me, but Christmas. There was that chocolate that I saw, so occasionally I succumb. I'm human. I'm a nutritionist. I succumb. But once I then get back to my regular way of eating, then it clears up again. So I think we have to keep in mind oxalate, histamine. By the way, oxalate can be related to poor blood sugar management. Blood sugar will mess with your brain too. So again, we might have more of a 3-ring circus even than just 2 players, because the research shows that if you are metabolically unwell, either metabolic syndrome, diabetes, anything which indicates that blood sugar is not well managed, your risk of kidney stones goes up. So that's a clear oxalate related piece of the puzzle. And so, yeah, I think again, we've got these things which are maybe kicking our butts in more than one way.
I really am. I'm going to call this episode "Relationship Status Complicated." A
I
chat
think
about
that's
oxalates
perfect.
history.
That's perfect.
Oh no, I appreciate that, Monique, so much. And as I mentioned just prior to asking that question, I'm going to lump these two together. And I don't often get a chance. I have had on a few podcasts that I've been the guest on to talk about my parasite mold journey and how now the research is coming out with chronic inflammatory response syndrome, which is CIRS. And again, we thank Judy Cho for her advocacy in this area, particularly in this community, getting a lot of stuff out there. But the listeners have asked a couple of questions. Is there connections between parasites and oxalates, and also chronic inflammatory response syndrome and oxalates? I say that all to say is that I'm super interested to hear what your thoughts are on this, Monique.
What I want to say to start out with is I do think because oxalate impacts mast cells and because oxalate drives inflammation and a kind of inflammation that the immune system is not kind of ready for, which is this sterile, non-related to infection, not necessarily true injury kind of inflammation. So you can have low-grade inflammation that's kind of going on all the time, which you may not actually be fully aware of because it may show up as low energy or it may show up as other things, right? And that kind of has the immune system chasing its own tail. Because the immune system's job, its raison d'etre, is that when there's inflammation, it has to come to the plate. It's the one that deals with injury, infection, those kinds of things. Well, if you've got this low-grade inflammation and it's happening all throughout the body, and then a parasite wanders along, will your immune system deal with it the way it normally would? Well, maybe not. And if it's chasing its own tail, it's not then doing the job you want it to do. So what I remember from being on a high oxalate diet is that I seemed to have no immune resilience. I'd get a cold, right? Everybody else in the family would be done in 5 days. And 4 weeks later, I'd be still trying to fight the thing off. But if your immune system is otherwise distracted over here and it's running around after oxalate related inflammation, maybe it's not allocating the resources to the problem that you've got, which is new, because it's stretched too thin. And like when it comes to then this idea of a chronic inflammatory response, makes perfect sense to me that you've got oxalate, which is known to be a driver of inflammation. And if you're taking in however much oxalate you're taking in, but let's say 1,000 milligrams, you and I can laugh over that because that's nothing. But let's say you're taking in that much a day, that's a pretty significant amount of oxalate. That could be driving pretty constant inflammation. Are your cells then going to be throwing up a white flag all the time saying, oh, there's a problem here? Yeah, I think they could be. And I think there's another condition that I've heard referred to as in cell danger response, and then mast cell and histamine intolerance. I suspect a lot of these things are potentially related to each other and could potentially be related to the fact that we have, I'm going to say, too many kinds of chemical exposures in modern life. Oxalate being one that we're not really paying attention to, but there's lots of other ones out there as well. And if they're all kind of driving an inflammatory response, your system can absolutely be stuck in a loop like a hamster on a wheel. And oxalate's not just a biochemical toxin, it is also a physical irritant, especially if you've got it in its insoluble form. So all kinds of stuff can be going on there. I really honestly, the more I work with people who have mast cell, or they tell me they have cell danger response, or they tell me they have CIRS, or they tell me they have histamine intolerance, the more I notice the similarities between all these things. And people who have chronic Lyme, or they have other kinds of chronic infections. I have actually had clients who got to the other side of Lyme, tested negative. I have had clients who got to the other side of other kinds of chronic infections, because once we got this chronic inflammation out of the way, then their immune system went, oh, look over there, there's an actual bad guy. And then it goes and does its job, right? So I do think there's a lot of potential hopefulness in being able to move oxalate out of the way. It's a bit of a bear while you're trying to get it out, as you and I both know.
And I look around and think about what you're saying, Monique, about how my immune system has recovered so well because I had replicating Epstein-Barr virus, chronic
Yep.
EBV.
Yep.
I had a bacterial infection. I had a parasitic infection. I
Yep.
definitely had oxalate overload. I mean, it ticked in all the box. And now, how I've repaired my gut, as I talked about, and my immune system, as you so correctly said, once it recognizes something, it can then go after the correct thing and not be on high alert all the time. I have people around me this flu and cold season dropping like flies, and I'm over here like, yeah, baby, my immune system's doing its job it's finally going, thank you, thank you. We can do what
Yeah.
we're meant to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And like that's what I notice is that I have a lot better immune resilience. Although, gosh, you put yourself under enough stress, you can still be dropped like an animal with a dart gun. But occasionally, I guess the immune system needs a bit of a workout too. So,
This is true. Monique, I'm going to do I did in the last question and just going to lump a couple of these together that I think fit really well. And these ones are to do with food. So the listeners asked a couple of ones related to food, and I'll finish off by asking one that's related to you in specific. But to avoid histamine, are egg yolks better than whites? And if you supplement minerals, which we advise with on an oxalate diet, can increased dumping symptoms occur by eating mineral-rich meats, inducing this dumping as well?
so when it comes to foods, really what we want is nutrient dense, low toxin. And we do want to have minerals. But can having more minerals available for some people mean that the body goes, zippy, I can get rid of this stuff? Yeah, it can. So what I generally recommend to people is we're looking for a sweet spot. But if you're very unwell, you've been unwell for a long time, you discover low oxalate, I would make moves very slowly with your diet. And I would, even with foods, I would not dive in head first with high mineral foods. So I sometimes will have clients start as simply as whatever their regular water is that they drink, reverse osmosis or whatever, have them add some good high quality mineral water in there that's got enough minerals. Or maybe I have them get a broad spectrum liquid electrolyte and start with a few drops of it and just see how their body tolerates it. Because the thing is, so many people go, well, like one of the questions was, which is how much oxalate can I handle in a day? Or how much minerals can I handle in a day? It's like, man, I want your sweet spot. It's not, I don't take the approach of, oh, the diagnostic level or the therapeutic level is this much. And so you just have to get there. We don't always recognize how much work is going on under the hood, if you will, that's not conscious to us that our bodies are dealing with. What you want is the right level of nutrient so that you can do the work that your body needs to do, but in a measured pace. Because again, if you feel miserable, there is no ribbon at the end of, your oxalate journey. There's health at the end, which is good. But if you go really fast and you stress yourself out, and you stress yourself out enough that histamine gets worse or other things get worse, there's just no benefit to that. We want to have people make use of nutrient dense foods, but in a measured kind of way so that you're doing the work you can do and you're doing the work in a way that preserves your resilience, doesn't just hammer away at you. And so many people just want to get it out. I completely understand this because back when I started a low oxalate diet, nobody knew you had to go slow, and I just wanted to get it out, and it was miserable. There's not enough benefit to that in my mind. So lots of people I know who start low oxalate, I might even suggest to them something like raw dairy if they handle it well, or cheese, or, other dairy products, but in smaller amounts. So do you want to, have some extra minerals on hand? Yes, because one of the basic things oxalate does is chelate minerals. So I actually consider that gentle, supportive, and kind of job one, because a lot of us might have low mineral levels down at the tissues and not really be aware of that. Or we might even be able to test low on some of these minerals. So you want to build that up. But again, our body is working towards a kind of homeostasis with whatever kind of diet we've been taking in. You don't want to go from here and flop this way. And then your body, you disrupt the stability it was giving you. We want to do this slow, steady, build a foundation, then be able to take the next step, build the foundation, be able to take the next step. So when it comes to foods, that's what I prefer. And when it comes to nutrient dense things like eggs, so if we want to get to that histamine piece, egg whites can be a histamine trigger. However, the research shows that the egg whites are fully cooked. For most of us, we will declaw that histamine trigger. And interestingly enough, I just saw research that talked about baked dairy and baked eggs as better tolerated by many people. So some of these processes that we can do may get us past some of the issues with them. So I wouldn't necessarily say that egg yolks are better than egg whites. Egg whites are a great protein source. Egg yolks are a great fat source. You're getting choline in the egg yolk that you're not getting in the white, blah, blah, blah. What I would say is if you have histamine issues, you're going to take in egg whites, make sure those egg whites are fully cooked. And that may give you the ability to tolerate it if you haven't been able to in the past.
Folks should know that my journey included, again, as I did with dairy, reacting to eggs early on. So I just did small bites, just added it very slowly. I even switched up the type of egg I was eating because they say that
Great.
duck eggs have a different type of protein that some people may not react to. And then I eliminated them completely for a while just to see, experimented on myself. I think that also again allowed me to heal my gut a little stronger. And now I'm back to I can absolutely tolerate them fine. In fact, I enjoy them every day. As folks that follow me on Instagram will see, I post my 2 eggs that I cook sunny side up every morning. I absolutely love them and love the nutrition that they provide.
Oh, and I should say also, like, rotate with your dairy sources too. I've tried water buffalo milk, I've tried goat milk, I've tried sheep milk, and in fact, sheep has got a much better nutrient profile overall than either cow or goat. So, and like goat and sheep have a different kind of casein than in cow's milk. So, a lot of these things can be handled with rotation and with intermittency. That can make a difference too in terms of how you react.
If you can believe it or not, Monique, we've got 2 more to go. We're going through these really well today and they're flowing very nicely. So, again, thank you to the listeners for submitting, and thank you as always to Monique for answering them. This next one ties into food because it's related by saying, do oxalate and histamine block weight loss? And if so, what is the mechanism?
Now, I don't know the mechanism. I wish I did, but it's very interesting that a lot of people who are dealing with oxalate will have either weight they can't lose or weight they can't gain. Oxalate is messing somewhere in perhaps some of the hormones that govern satiation and also how we use calories. Like if insulin's high, we may be storing calories in a way that we wouldn't normally. If insulin is lower, we may not be able to get sort of access to some of these calories, or we may be sort of wasting them. So I'm not sure exactly how this works, but what I can say is that on the Trying Low Oxalate support group, we get a lot of people who report as they start to lower oxalate, they cannot get full. And so there's some disruption there of satiation, or maybe the body is saying, "Oh, we need nutrients, we need nutrients, we need," because they're doing it. There's all sorts of work going on to try and handle the free radical, pro-oxidative, mineral chelation, blah, 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 that oxalate's doing. And so in my case, once I got on a low oxalate diet, I was able to start to lose some weight. But I've also seen people who weren't able to gain weight starting to gain as they got on a low oxalate diet. So there's something going on there. And as I said earlier, we do know that if people have metabolic syndrome, they're more likely to have oxalate issues. So there's definitely something going on with weight and oxalate and potentially some of these big hormones like insulin and ghrelin and blah blah blah, where we're starting to look at how the metabolism itself gets managed. There could be hormone and oxalate trafficking interactions there too.
What I found was a lot of people, and we've been talking about dairy, that slowed down on the dairy because it's so delicious and there is the casomorphines in there and it can become very addicting that people, when they go carnivore, and especially if they're high oxalate like ourselves, I was like, oh, yay, I can tolerate dairy again. I'm going to just go at it. But dairy itself is meant to put on weight on young cows, and it can cause us to gain weight quite rapidly if we're not careful with our dairy intake, can't it?
Yeah, and there is those opioid receptors in the gut. So for some people, dairy will also cause motility to slow down. So dairy can have lots of really interesting effects that we may want to think really carefully about how much of it we consume. And, for sure, if you're getting inflammatory effects from it, I would at least temporarily come off and watch for any sort of addictive kind of, boy, I really want that, because yeah, there's lots of things going on there with dairy.
Absolutely. I told the story on the last podcast I did. We discussed dairy, that I've been going through a little bit of a stressful period in my life the last few months, Monique, and I started to notice my consumption of dairy creeping up. I was like, yeah, a couple extra slices of cheese today. I deserve it. I'll take a little bit of heavy whipping cream extra in the evenings. And it's very easy to do for sure.
I just want to add, because it is really important. We need to be kind to ourselves when we want to do this, because we are trying to hack our neurotransmitters with our diet. And that is not laziness or moral depravity or, other things that sometimes we can layer onto this. It really is, a growth opportunity to find another way to manage that emotional impact. But it's 100%, I would say, benevolent, if you will. We're not doing it out of malevolence. We're not doing it to punish ourselves. We're not like all these sort of judgments that we make. It's really, we're trying to manage our emotional state, our neurotransmitters, and how we feel in our body. And stress does things, and we're trying to manage that. So if we can give ourselves a little bit of a get out of jail free card on that, because I've gone through that cycle many times. And what I do now is go, right, I was doing the best I can. I get back on the horse. So when you get better at just telling yourself, I'll just get back on the horse. It happened. I'll be okay. I'm just going to get back on the horse. And the more times you do it that way without the self-flagellation, if you will, the better it goes.
Completely agree. This last question, Monique, was a late submission, but I'm glad we're able to get to it for the listener today. And it has to do with the thyroid. And it asks, thyroid antibodies have gone up on a low ox diet. Is this normal?
So as oxalate's leaving your body, there's lots of places where it can be impacting you. And it's well known, actually, in the research that oxalate can accumulate in the thyroid over time. So there was this very interesting piece of research that I found where researchers who had donated thyroid glands from people who had passed got to the point in their examination of them where they could actually fairly accurately estimate the age of the person based on how much oxalate was in their thyroid. That's kind of interesting because that really speaks to the whole bioaccumulation. And it also speaks to, and these were people who didn't necessarily die of thyroid related conditions. These were people who had just passed with other things. So it also speaks to the fact that the thyroid may be vulnerable in some way to oxalate. Now, with that said, if you've got pro-inflammatory oxalate and it's creating a bit of a problem in the thyroid, could you drive up antibodies? I think that would make sense. The immune system may come to bear there, right? So is it, I don't know the word normal kind of fits. Some people can have thyroid antibodies go up. Some people will find that their thyroid doesn't function as well, that they may have issues with high TSH or low T3 because of the fact that the oxalate's impacting how the thyroid functions. You also need magnesium to convert T4 to T3, which is your active form. So if oxalate's chelating magnesium out of the system, you may have things which are impacting it. So I'll often see people wanting to use a lot of iodine because their thyroid is compromised, and that may not be the right response. So you can get these kinds of things where oxalate tends to be trafficked. Another one that I see, which I'll mention because it's kind of related to this, is that you can have your liver enzymes suddenly come up. And that really gets people's attention. They get very concerned about that. But I have had a number of clients where liver enzymes went up. They got through an initial dumping phase, which might have lasted a bit of time, put their body under a bit of stress, and then it'll start to drop down. And their doctor will say, I don't know what's happening. And I'll go, I bet it's oxalate. Now, that's a hypothesis, but because I know that sulfate transporters in the liver can also be moving oxalate, I think it would be a reasonable thing if we can get a researcher to be curious here and check this out. And I have had people have some funny things happen with pancreatic enzymes. And again, that really alarms people. And it alarms me. I make sure they go to their doctor when any of these things happen. I make sure they get checked out. But what usually occurs under these circumstances is the doctor doesn't know why it's happening and then doesn't know why it stops happening. And so I tend to take a bit of a conservative approach, go and make sure nothing bad's going on, go and exclude the obvious kinds of diagnoses. And in the absence of something clear, let's assume for the short term that it's oxalate and that you're going to monitor this with your doctor. And as I said, I've seen lots of these kinds of, distressing kinds of results on a test kind of resolve themselves over time as we get their diet right and as oxalate's leaving their body. So I think that's another one with the thyroid too.
Thank you, Monique. I just want to end out the episode by asking you, it's 2024, and again, Happy New Year to you and yours. What plans have you for 2024? And you can relate to anything to do with your coaching, your personal life. You got anything exciting with the Wizards of Ox coming up that the listeners should be aware of? What's happening on the Monique Attinger side?
Well, you know what? After a very stressful 2023, I've decided that 2024 has to be about living well. And I'm actually kind of in private using the term, having a yummy life because we trade our time for what we get. And while that's not necessarily related to oxalate, it's I think it's something that a lot of us have to keep in mind. If we've got a lot of stress in our life, if we're really pushing really hard at some things, oxalate's not going to help you in that endeavor. And we might need to consider that you don't get time back once it's passed. So you might as well enjoy it while you're experiencing it. So yeah, my year this year is going to be about getting the right balance between what I'm doing elsewhere and, family needs and what makes my heart sing. So with that said, the Wizards of Ox will be back. We're on hiatus at the moment, but we will be back doing more videos. That is fun. I adore my colleagues, Patricia De La Garza, Carla Wiersma, and Susan Owens. And I think it's really helpful to people to be able to hear us talk and hear different experiences and different sides of things. And we do have different strengths. So we'll speak to different aspects of something to do with oxalate. So yeah, we will definitely be back with that. At the moment, we're just trying to figure out what topics we want to add to and what things are on the radar. From the standpoint of my own coaching practice, I have had people asking for a book. So I'm trying to figure out how I might get some time to write a book. And I'm also looking at things like more group coaching because my one-on-one coaching is very important to me, but I think I need to have some time in my life for some flexibility. So I'm going to be reducing some of those hours. So I'm looking for other ways where people can get access to me and be able to do that, maybe even at a better price point too, where everybody wins. And so I'm looking at some new offerings in terms of group coaching and things like that. So it should be an interesting year for me. And if I add to that my youngest is about to graduate from grade 12, we've got some fun things coming up on the horizon. And my eldest is engaged, and the wedding planning is in swing. So yeah, I've got to make some room for some happy things on the personal side too. So.
Completely agree, Monique. And you and I, as always, are just like this aligned because I literally made a post on my Twitter this morning with a quote that I saw, and it spoke just to that. And it says, "Time is not refundable. Use it with intention." And it's so true. And it points to what you just talked about. Monique, I'll make sure that the listeners, as always, have the links to your website, to your Instagram, to your Twitter, to the Wizards of Ox YouTube page and your YouTube page in the show notes. And, as an aside, I just wanted to mention to you that it's World Carnivore Month as we record this, and that's January. I think now that Oxalate is getting its day, we need to have a month, and it should be Oxtober or something like that. We should,
October, I like it. I
yeah.
like that. That's awesome.
We need to have a low Oxtober. The Oxalate clearly is getting in the vernacular now, which I'm so happy about because I see people on Twitter answering questions talking, about oxalate and lowering their oxalate intake all over the place now. And I'm so happy because folks like you and others that are out there that are teaching people, and we appreciate you, Monique. Thank you again for this. I just say it every time. I love these chats. It's like chatting with a dear friend, as you often say, and I feel the same way on my side. And it's clearly benefiting and helping the listeners. So thank you for all that you do.
Once I realized that this made such a difference in my own life, I thought, how many people out there are dealing with an oxalate problem? They don't realize it's an oxalate problem. Like, how many else like me are not ever going to be diagnosed because they've never thrown a kidney stone in their lives? So yeah, it's definitely my passion. So I am looking for other ways to be able to get the word out there. And yeah, I love the idea of a World Oxalate Month. I think that would be awesome. And for those who I do want to add to places where you can find me, because for those who would like to learn more, like to read more in depth on some of these topics, I do have a Patreon group, and there I post 4 times a week easily, often written things, but everything I'll go from the sublime to the ridiculous. So one day it might be a picture of what my family ate so that people can get an idea of how easy it can be to put together a low oxalate meal. And the day after that could be an in-depth article I just did one on sleep with all sorts of research links so they can follow up on why I think the way I think about it. And I also have menu plans up there so that if people are looking for, well, how do I do this? And I need it to be simple. And can you spoon feed me something? Here's some menu plans, right? And I also have a monthly live Zoom that I do just for the Patreon people who subscribe at the highest level. And that gives them some, access to me directly. So I do have some other things where people can look at if they want to kind of dig in more to the topic area.
Monique Attinger, always an honor and a pleasure. I do hope we get the chance to connect in person sometime soon. And you're always welcome on Carnivorist Chats because we just adore you. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, James. It was fun as usual. If people wonder, do I really laugh like this? I really do laugh like this when life is fun. So it's good.
Thank you, Monique. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, James. You too.
And that's a wrap on this episode of Carnivorist Chats. If you've made it this far, I want to say thank you for listening, and also thank you in advance for liking, subscribing, or sharing this episode. Thanks again to Equip Foods, Carnivore Snacks, and the Carnivore Bar. Don't forget to check the link in the show notes to get a discount on their products. Until the next time, be well.